Welcome to the Sky News Daily. I'm Niall Paterson, in the hall, eagerly awaiting Sir Keir Starmer's big speech to the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. Last week, of course, Rishi Sunak was grabbing the headlines after he scrapped the HS2 link between Birmingham and Manchester, making that announcement in Manchester, of course. Today, well, for Sir Keir, it's all about getting Britain's future back. So we're expecting some big policy announcements, particularly on house building, and no doubt plenty of bashing of the Tories, which always goes down well with the delegates. But whereas the Prime Minister needed to deliver the speech of his life, the jury remains out, what Sir Keir Starmer needs is to avoid any hint of triumphalism or complacency. Events in Israel and Gaza have somewhat overshadowed this conference. We would certainly expect the Labour leader to address the bloodshed and once again offer his complete support to Israel. A little later on in the podcast, I will be speaking to our defence and security analyst, Michael Clarke, to get the latest on the conflict. For now, though, let's find out what Sir Keir Starmer has to say.
True democracy is citizen-led. Politics needs an update. We demand a people's house. We demand a people's house. We are in crisis.
I think, yeah, that is someone who's rushed onto the stage and has just dumped a load of glitter over Sir Keir Starmer's head. Well, what exactly happened there? I just caught a glimpse of someone running onto the stage just as Sir Keir Starmer was beginning to speak. Glitter thrown all over his jacket. He's now taking the jacket off.
Protest or power, that's why we changed our party conference. That's why.
With a big smile on his face as well, I have to say. Doesn't feel like this is the point at which Sir Keir Starmer is going to be distracted, not even by a man carrying glitter and shouting slogans.
This new path can only be walked by a new party, a changed Labour Party, no longer enthralled to gesture politics, no longer a party of protest, a decade of national renewal. That's what it will take. We will need ambition, determination, patience, absolutely. But also brave politics feels broken. When our public services are broken, our public finances wrecked, the Tory mortgage bombshell that's blown up the finances of millions. Nurses, teaching assistants, builders, drivers, shop workers, carers, people who never before missed a payment in their life, working harder than ever for the wage in their pocket. Agents say, in a cry of defiance to all those who now write our country off, Britain must, Britain can, Britain will get its future back. Thank you, conference. Thank you, conference.
As you can hear, that speech going down incredibly well with everyone in the room. And I think in part that was due to the intervention at the beginning by that protester. Let's have a little wander towards the front of the stage, see if we can't find a couple of shadow cabinet ministers to find out what they think. Lisa Nandy, what did you make of the speech? And let's start with what happened at the very beginning, the protester. I wonder if that might have worked in Sir Keir's favour.
Well, I think so, because like he said straight away, if he thinks that's going to stop him, then he doesn't know Keir Starmer. And I think the whole audience was rooting for him already in this hall, you could feel it. But I think the whole country will have been rooting for him, seeing the determination to get Labour's message across. The question we had to answer today was why Labour? And that's precisely what that speech just did. We're looking ahead to the next general election. We've proved we're fit to govern again. We've proved we're hungry to govern again.
John Ashworth, what did you make of the speech then?
I thought that was a phenomenal speech. Not because it pleased people here in the hall, because it spoke for the country.
Well, I've made my way out of the conference hall round to our temporary ad hoc Sky News Daily podcast studio, where guess who we have found once again. It's almost like we've got you on retainer, our deputy political editor, Sam Coates.
But you do actually pay me to do this job.
Not personally, thank goodness. We have to start with the bit that happened before Sir Keir Starmer had even opened his mouth. That protester running onto the stage. And I suppose there are 2 points that I want your reflections on, Sam. First, I think it actually worked in Sir Keir Starmer's favour. Second, how many times are we going to see a security breach like this at a party conference? I mean, the guy could have been carrying a knife. That's the simple truth.
Look, it was an extraordinary moment. In that speech, Keir Starmer had a line, "We are not the party of protest." And in a funny way, that in the biggest picture way this week, with everything that's going on outside, I think he has proved that claim to be true. But there at the start of his speech was somebody running on stage, covering him in glitter, and it was, I think we can call it a failed protest, because although he mounted a protest, we have no idea the substance of it beyond some vague claim about democracy. I suspect strongly this will work in his favour. His unflappable demeanour, the fact that he just calmly waited as everybody around him did their thing, clearly had the audience on their side. I noticed that the shadow cabinet led the room doing what the cabinet did with Theresa May when she was confronted with a protester in 2017, and basically standing ovationed their way through the problem. And it's quite a good technique to do that. It shows that despite the disruption, the audience is on your side. And that look all the way through the speech, with the jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled up, and glitter over his forehead and his hair, added an additional level of raw, I suspect he would hope it was seen as authenticity, to somebody who occasionally seems like a bit of a stuffed shirt. Today actually was able, through events unplanned and that nobody would have wanted to see, to show a flexibility and an agility to allow something like that to work in his favour.
So all of the speech itself, what was Keir Starmer trying to do today, and how close did he get to accomplishing that task? I mean, it was ultimately, at its core, a big question. Why Labour?
And his answer to that was to say that Labour are the healers, the modernisers and the builders. His starting point was the same starting point that Rishi Sunak had last week. And this is important and interesting. Rishi Sunak announced that he, despite having Conservatives in government 13 years, was going to take a new approach to politics, that he, Rishi Sunak, was going to take long-term decisions. But whereas for Rishi Sunak, that comes with all the obvious problems of you've been in government, here Keir Starmer framed, I thought, the most effective part of the speech as simply an attack on the Conservatives' record. You know, he talked about long-term solutions not being oven ready. He talked about no sticking plaster politics time and time again in that speech. And I think in that, he was trying to mount an argument that this Labour Party can be changed. Now, it was change through slogans and vibes, not hard policy designed to be remembered. But the most important thing I think they were trying to do was provide you with some slogans that they were hoping that people would take away from this conference.
What I find fascinating as well was the ownership of the record that Labour had the last time that they were in government, and indeed the response that there was from the floor to that.
One of the surprising things that we saw today was that Keir Starmer has another gear that I haven't come across before, and it's a sort of almost preacher-like vibe, and it reminds me of late Gordon Brown. And funnily enough, that's not just my analysis. There are clues in this speech that he is directly adopting the approach of late Gordon Brown. He has these passages, almost lists, that build through huge crescendos, very like late Gordon Brown era speeches. But more than that, he opened by, without being explicit about this, referencing and reading out a part of Gordon Brown's last speech as Labour Prime Minister. It was right on page 1, early on in the speech, where he was saying, look, after all these years of Conservative government, where is their minimum wage? Where is their sure start? For students of politics, or for figures on the left, that has resonance, because there is a YouTube video of Gordon Brown delivering that passage, those words, setting out Labour's record, both under Tony Blair, under him, to that last Labour conference in 2009. And the left love it. They think it is the marker of what they believe is the achievement and what is possible under a Labour government. And there he was again, reading it out himself, but framing it as a question to the Conservatives. So it is not that we are accidentally comparing him to Gordon Brown. He is inviting and drawing a surprising comparison, and I thought showed that he can deliver such a speech with the passion and the brimstone that perhaps we haven't always seen from him, but he showed on the stage today that he could do it.
Did he need to go further? Did he need to do more than, as you say, use the slogans? Give us a kind of the thematic approach that a Labour government will adopt? Or did he need to have more policy up his sleeve to be unveiled, a la Rishi Sunak?
Look, I think that's the great big gamble that this Labour Party has taken at this point in time. They've decided that they can delay a few more, what ghastly political journalists like me use the ghastly phrase, retail offers. In other words, things that people can bank on, that will reward their lives. That will come later. The job of this conference predominantly has been to provide reassurance and hope. And the political strategy that underlines that is there is no need to fire up those already committed to the Labour Party. The desire at this conference has been to find a way of harnessing the fact that what they really want to do, what will really get them over the line in this election, is to get Tory voters to stay at home. And you get Tory voters to stay at home by not appearing threatening, not appearing frightening, by appearing a safe choice. And in the absence of some big ticket item about social care or big promise about childcare, there is a desire not to look like the people who are going to spend a lot of money, rock the boat, cause a lot of, trigger a lot of risk, cause a lot of uncertainty. It's a gamble. It's one that they have actively chosen, and there is a political reason and a voter that they are doing it specifically to try and motivate.
There was one part that I was really fascinated by, and that was where the Labour leader started talking about, people wanting more. That, treats from the supermarket, for example. The ability to go on holiday. I suppose, if you take a step back, that all falls into one of the themes that was in the speech. Getting Britain's future back, anticipating a brighter future ahead, despite the fact that, again, as he said explicitly, it's going to take time and it's going to be painful.
You sort of got a sense, I think, in this speech that Keir Starmer was trying to communicate that he understands and has actually personally shared some of the anxieties that face people in their ordinary life. Now, Sir Keir Starmer, QC, sometimes has a challenge convincing people that he's not posh, that he's not a member of the elite, though in many, many senses he, of course, is. But he wanted to convey he understood the idea that he has had setbacks and challenges and things to overcome. He talks about the Pebble Dash house that he grew up in many, many times. I think he understands his weakness and is trying to turn it into a strength, and it will be interesting to see whether that succeeds.
It is one of the curiosities of the way that Labour do their conferences, that this is not the speech that closes the conference. Indeed, I will be leaving shortly and getting on a train to get back to London, but you will be staying up. When this conference concludes, on the basis of what we saw there, do you think Keir Starmer thinks job well done?
Like Liberal Democrat conference, and unlike Tory conference, I think this Labour conference will have succeeded on its own terms to deliver the message they wanted to, because everything's gone off basically fine and the reception stuff has been fine. The bigger essay question about this conference is, given it was a vibes not policy message to the country, does it get noticed? Are people even aware that it's taken place? And does it help shift the dial, given that it doesn't really answer the questions, if public services are so problematic, you're not going to spend lots of money on them, can I really believe that they're going to improve? And what actual thing are you going to do that relieves some of the enormous strain on my life? This conference didn't answer either of those in any, talk of modernisation, talk of some help, but it didn't really substantively answer those two questions. And I think there are answers that Labour have, they're just coming later. So in the absence of those things, was broadly rhetoric and good vibes and looking sensible and delivering what you wanted and being professional and having a party looking like it's united behind you enough to start and continue the job of reassuring the public that this is a party that can be elected, or is that not enough to get noticed?
Sam? Enjoy the rest of the conference. Many thanks indeed. We will be back in just a moment where, indeed, we will be reflecting on events in Israel with our security and defence analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Stay where you are. Welcome back to the Daily from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. And we're going to move away from the politics for a few minutes, however, and focus once again on the war in the Middle East. Israel, well, it is continuing with extensive strikes on the Gaza Strip, whilst maintaining that air, sea and land blockade. An effective siege is now underway, with Gaza's more than 2 million residents also having their water and electricity turned off. And with every hour that passes, we learn more about the atrocities inflicted on Israeli civilians. Professor Michael Clarke is Sky's defence and security analyst. Good to talk to you again, Michael. It feels as if we are gearing up for a land incursion into Gaza, doesn't it?
It does, and I don't see how the Israelis are going to avoid that, because they have pledged that they are going to destroy Hamas now, and they certainly can't do that just with a bombing campaign, however extensive it is, and it is pretty extensive now. And so some sort of move against Gaza itself, I think, is almost inevitable. And all that we can see of Israeli preparations would indicate that that's exactly what they've got in mind. We don't know exactly where and exactly when, but I don't think it'll be very long.
What do we make of that kind of massive build-up of tanks? That plus calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists, plus telling ordinary Israelis to prepare to shelter for a number of days, suggests that the tempo of this conflict is not de-escalating, it is escalating.
Yes, it is. I mean, the Israelis have called up 300,000 reservists. I mean, their normal army is about 165,000. So they're calling up about twice the number that they would normally have in the army, which shows not that they're going to use all of those troops, but that they anticipate that this could be a really long campaign. I mean, long that goes beyond a few weeks into months, maybe for the rest of the year and into next year, because it may then spread around the region. And they're particularly worried that they may have a two-front problem, not just with Gaza, but also with Lebanon, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and possibly with the West Bank as well. So it's possible that they might be fighting on three fronts at once. The tanks are important, but we've got to be aware that for an involvement in Gaza, tanks are very vulnerable. It's the graveyard of armoured vehicles going into a densely populated urban area. It's the hardest thing for a military force to do, but I'm pretty sure the Israelis will do that, but it will be infantry heavy. They'll use lots of new technologies, lots of drones, lots of precision weapons, but ultimately it'll come down to individuals on the ground having to edge forward building by building.
What do these tactics suggest also, Michael, about the way in which the Israelis will be going after the hostages, the numerous civilians and indeed members of the IDF that have been taken by Hamas? I mean, in this built-up urban environment, it must be like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Yes, it's really difficult. Gaza is one of the most densely populated parts of the globe. The Secretary General of the United Nations has said this morning that about 137,000 people are already sheltering in schools and hospitals. But there's a limit to how many people can shelter in schools and hospitals in such a densely populated place. And of course, there are about 100 or 130 odd known Israeli hostages spread around the territory, which is one reason why I think the Israelis will try to move in from all points at once, because they know that some of the hostages may well suffer because of this, but they must figure that their best chances will be to move in simultaneously as quickly as possible from all points and get their special forces to raid those areas where they may know that hostages, or at least some of them, are being held.
Gaza is now, as mentioned before, effectively under siege, switching off the water, switching off the electricity, and numerous airstrikes ahead of, as we've just been discussing, that incursion by land. A lot of people are talking about the doctrine of collective punishment, the idea that perhaps the Israeli tactics that are being used at the moment will undoubtedly affect civilians who are not combatants. What do you make of that? Explain this doctrine of collective punishment.
The most obvious example is that when they've arrested somebody or killed somebody who's a known terrorist, and then they go to the family and they evict the family from the houses and just blow up their houses. So they make the family suffer, or they make the neighborhood suffer for the fact that terrorists are in there. That is collective punishment. And the Israelis always argue that there are reasons why this is not collective punishment, or there are reasons why there are no alternatives. But there's no question about it. Collective punishment is against the law, And against that, of course, you've got this question of proportionality. The Israelis are, at the moment, understandably hurt and angry, just as angry as the Americans were after 9/11, because this is a very similar psychological blow, and it looks as if it will have about the same number of casualties eventually. And so you can understand the Israelis not caring very much for the niceties of international law, but in the long run, these things do matter. And all the sympathy that goes towards Israel at the moment, which is undoubtedly the case, will likely switch in a couple of weeks' time towards what the world may see as a disproportionate response that is affecting the 2.3 million people who live in Gaza, the vast majority of whom are innocent.
What then, Michael, is the role of the international community going to be as we move further into this conflict, not just in support of the Israeli pursuit of Hamas, but also in communicating via diplomatic channels when we approach that point, when it does start to feel as if the tactics being used by the Israelis are disproportionate to the circumstances?
Well, there's, I think, two ways in which the international community will be required to think carefully. One is humanitarian aid as much as possible. And very interestingly, Qatar has already made some very good concrete proposals. They've said, look, there are women and children on both sides. I mean, there are women and children among the Israeli hostages that have been taken into Gaza. There are women and children among the Palestinian prisoners that the Israelis hold. Let's arrange at least an exchange of women and children. And there's some sort of good, hard thinking behind that. It won't change the nature of the conflict, but it's a peripheral alleviation. It's a little silver lining. And the international community should imitate what Qatar is doing. So there'll be lots of those sorts of proposals. Anything that can alleviate the suffering would be very useful. But then the second thing that the international community needs to do is to keep Israel honest. I mean, we know that as these operations progress, they tend to become more brutal because there's a dynamic of violence, and it's hard for the most disciplined forces to really contain themselves. And we've all got examples of that in all of our armed forces, one way or another. And so the international community must keep Israel honest as it goes through this operation to eliminate Hamas. And that operation itself is not illegitimate. I mean, Hamas is a designated terrorist organization. It's not a guerrilla group. It's a terrorist organization as designated by the United States and Britain and most of Europe and certainly Israel. And the Western world said that ISIS, remember, that swept through Syria and Iraq in 2015, 2016, and we conducted a bombing campaign and a ground campaign to eliminate it on the basis that it was legal to eliminate an overtly terrorist group. So what Israel intends to do is not illegal, to eliminate a terrorist group, but they've got to do it in a way that does not offend international law or the sort of basic humanitarian principles of the international community.
And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily, and indeed for the Labour Party conference. We'll see you next time.